Hello everyone, my name is Jerry Morris, and today I will be discussing the paper Stealthy Dopant-level Hardware Trojans. The goal of this paper is to propose a new approach to implementing a hardware Trojan that is resistant to the most common detection techniques. The authors demonstrate their approach by inserting their hardware Trojans into two architectures that are otherwise known to be relatively secure. Before we dig deep into the paper, I'd like to give an overview on what will be discussed. We will first discuss what a hardware Trojan is and how it affects integrated circuits. I'll then explain what integrated circuits are, how they are made, and how the paper described these circuits. Next, we will look at related work in terms of developing and detecting hardware Trojans. Then we will dive into the two cases that are introduced in this paper. We will then conclude with a recap of what we discussed. To begin, it is important to discuss some relevant information, beginning with describing what a hardware Trojan is. A hardware Trojan is a malicious modification of a hardware circuit. The name comes from ancient history where Greeks used a wooden statue of a horse to enter Troy. The wooden horse was hollow and filled with Greek warriors, including Odysseus. The horse looked like a gift, so the people of Troy wheeled the statue into their city. During nightfall, the Greek warriors exited the horse and opened the gates to allow the rest of the Greek warriors to enter. Thus, the point of this story is to describe how something might look innocent but is truly malicious. Thus, a hardware Trojan is a modification of a hardware circuit that is meant to go undetected in order to likely wreak havoc. A malicious modification like this can have multiple effects, such as compromising the confidentiality, integrity, or authentication of the hardware. Hardware Trojans can cause a leakage of information, allow for a backdoor into the system, or lead to a shorter lifespan for the product. This is quite bad as the hardware is normally considered the root of trust in the system. Root of trust refers to the process of ensuring secure operations on the system. Trust begins with the keys located within the hardware. This then validates the firmware located on the hardware. Each piece relies on the piece below it. If the hardware cannot be trusted, none of the above systems can be trusted either. If the cryptographic keys are compromised, the whole system is compromised. In the following image, we see an example of a hardware Trojan where the intention is to leak information. On the top, labeled A, there is an untampered circuit, which has inputs that lead into the intended output. We also see the hardware Trojan, which requires a specific input to trigger the Trojan. This causes the output to be modified from its intended purpose. Here we see a payload output. In the bottom of the image, labeled C, we see a hardware circuit that has been tampered with and a Trojan has been inserted. Now the circuit can work as intended until the circuit receives the specific input that triggers the Trojan to modify the output. Thus, a normal input leads to a normal output, whereas a trigger input leads to a modified output. Now that we understand what a hardware Trojan is, it is important to discuss what an integrated circuit is, as well as the different levels of an integrated circuit. This will help us understand where Trojans could be inserted. An integrated circuit is a tiny chip that is composed of many smaller components, such as transistors, resistors, and capacitors. These integrated circuits are housed on a silicon wafer, where the silicon is a semiconductor material. Each integrated circuit houses up to billions of the smaller components that make up the chip. The components in the pictures we see are likely bigger than the ones you would find in an integrated circuit, but my hope is that you have seen components like these. Integrated circuits are used in almost every electronic device. This includes military devices and products used in critical infrastructure. Because of this, it is important for these circuits to be safe and defended against malicious modifications. The development process of an integrated circuit happens in many stages. A blueprint must be created that describes the purpose of the circuit. This must then be converted into logic and implemented within a circuit. It is then designed to physically fit onto a wafer. The chip is then manufactured on a wafer, where each chip is packaged into a casing, as seen in the image on the right. There are a lot of steps to the manufacturing process, which leads to a lot of opportunities for a rogue designer or fabricator to implement a Trojan. As described in the paper, quote unquote, circuit blocks in a single integrated chip are designed by different parties, manufactured by an external and possibly offshore foundry, packaged by a separate company, and supplied by an independent distributor. As you can imagine, this can cause security and trust issues to arise. Now that we understand how a chip is made, I'd like to discuss the levels of an integrated circuit that are mentioned in this paper. Unfortunately, I could not find an image to describe these levels, so I created a pyramid containing all the levels that are needed to understand the paper. The most specific level mentioned is the sub-transistor level. This contains the dopant level mentioned in the title of this paper. This level consists of transistors, diodes, resistors, capacitors, and the physics behind these components. The gate level describes the logic created by these lower level components. This creates logic gates such as AND, OR, XOR, etc. The netlist level describes the connection between the circuits, such as the way gates can be connected. The layout level describes how these components are physically placed on the device, which is typically a silicon wafer. The hardware description level, or HDL level, describes the behavior and functionality of a device, typically by using a programming language. Although this does not go into the full process of integrated circuit development, it provides a baseline for understanding the levels mentioned in this paper. With the knowledge of these levels, I would like to ask the audience where they believe most hardware Trojans are inputted into a system. If you guessed the hardware description level, you are correct. In the related work section of this paper, the authors discuss previous research efforts, which are mostly highlighted on the hardware description level. They split this research into two topics: implementing hardware Trojans and detecting hardware Trojans. For implementing hardware Trojans, the authors state that most Trojans are added at the HDL level. One instance is research done by King et al. In their paper called Proceedings of the First U.S. Enix Workshop on Large-Scale Exploits and Emergent Threats. In this paper, they discuss adding a hardware Trojan into a CPU, which allowed an attacker to have complete control of the system. This included having the ability to modify code on the system as well as accessing all parts of the system's memory. Another hardware Trojan mentioned involves creating a hidden side channel attack, which causes secret keys to be leaked. The goal of a side channel attack is to gather information without directly affecting the functionality of the system. Since this attack does not modify the execution of a system, it is hard to detect. To understand what a side channel attack is, I have an example that could be related to the real world. Let's say you want to track where someone is going with their vehicle. You could attempt to follow them, but you risk being detected. Instead, if you were able to measure differences in the vehicle, you could make inferences on how it is being used. For example, if you see the car on day one and it is shiny and spotless, you can presume that it hasn't been driven far since being cleaned. On day two, if the sides of the vehicle are covered in mud, it can be inferred that the vehicle was driven somewhere that received a lot of rain and did not have complete asphalt roads. To go even further, let's say you could track the amount of gas in the vehicle. If you measure the difference in gas between day one and day two, you could estimate the radius in which the vehicle has driven. Note that this example is assuming the gas isn't refilled, and that the car was driven to a single destination and then returned to its original location. In the following image, I have drawn a circle around the drill field, which has a radius of 1 mile. If a car drove away from the drill field and returned with a fuel loss equivalent to 2 miles, I can infer that they drove about a mile away. I could then guess that they visited someone around the edge of the circle, maybe on Tom's Creek Road or on Draper Road. With this logic, it is possible for an attacker to make inferences about a system based on changes that the system goes through. The related work describes a side channel attack where it uses an additional circuit to monitor the encryption process on a system. By measuring leakage, the authors are able to infer the encryption process and reverse engineer this method to cause a leakage of encryption keys. HDL-level hardware Trojan attacks can be hard to implement, as they must be added during the manufacturing process. Finding the space on an integrated circuit to add a hardware Trojan can be difficult. These Trojans can also be detected by using optical reverse engineering, which I will describe in more detail shortly. Another method of hardware Trojan implementation goes a little deeper into the layout level. The authors mention another attack method by Shivangovsky et al., which involves changing the dopant concentration of the system. This causes the circuit to age faster, thus reducing the lifespan of the product. This attack is less about gathering information and more about damaging the product, possibly leading to damaging the reputation of the company that represents the product. We can now discuss hardware Trojan detection methods, such as the optical reverse engineering method previously mentioned. These detection methods are split into two further categories: pre-manufacturing detection and post-manufacturing detection. Pre-manufacturing detection focuses on finding Trojans at the HDL level by using functional testing. Beyond detection, it is also important to think about how these Trojans can be defended against. Some ideas revolve around redundancy and adding control circuits, but even with these mechanisms, they are not helpful against lower-level hardware Trojans that could be implemented at the sub-transistor level. Post-manufacturing can also involve functional testing, but since the tester does not know what triggers a Trojan, it can be hard to create a helpful test case for detection. Functional testing also does not defend against Trojans whose purpose is to shorten the lifespan, as the device will look like it's working properly now, but will not show issues until the future. Another post-manufacturing method involves having a golden chip. A golden chip is essentially the control of the experiment. For example, in a science experiment, there should be a control group that is known as the source of truth. For example, if a new weight loss drug were to be developed, it would be important to test the efficacy of the drug. You would want one group to take the weight loss drug, one group to take a placebo pill marked as a weight loss drug, and you would also want to have a group that continues their lifestyle as normal. This would be your control group, and they would be compared against the weight loss drug as well as the placebo pill. In the same sense of hardware and integrated circuits, you want a group that is unmodified. This would be a device that is known to not have any Trojans. Optical reverse engineering is used to find a golden chip. Chips are deconstructed layer by layer, and each layer is photographed using a scanning electron microscope. If these photos match the layout mask information, then there should not be any malicious modifications. Additional wires and metals should be caught during this process. The issue with this method is that it requires chips to be destroyed. This is time-consuming and expensive. This method is also weak against dopant polarity changes as it is deemed impractical to have test cases for such an issue. Now that we have discussed background information and related work, we can get into the contributions of this paper. The authors introduced two cases where their Trojan is able to be implemented without detection while also passing tests for security. As stated previously, most hardware Trojans are implemented at the HDL level. The authors state that their Trojans are inserted at the layout level, but mention that their technique also modifies processes at the sub-transistor level. Their method also involves modifying the dopant polarity similar to the previously mentioned layout level hardware Trojan. The difference is that their goal is to do more than cause damage at the layout level. As we explained previously, the other method only was able to cause damage on the lifespan. Does anyone know what doping means when it comes to the manufacturing process of semiconductors? I didn't until I researched this paper. Doping is a process that helps modify the conductivity of a silicon wafer. To change a component's electrical characteristic, impurities are added to a semiconductor. By applying different dopant polarities, the target's behavior predictably changes. The first case study in this paper involves Intel's Ivy Bridge RNG. Given that this paper was published in 2013, it is understandable as to why they chose this target. In 2013 and 2014, the Ivy Bridge RNG was implemented in many Intel processors, such as the Core i3, Core i5, Core i7, and Xeon processor groups. At this time, it was new and considered cryptographically secure. This system generated random 128-bit numbers and was verified by multiple independent security companies. By modifying the digital post-processing at the sub-transistor level, the authors were able to compromise the security of the generated keys. They are able to modify the number of bits that the RNG outputs. Instead of 128 bits, it can be any chosen number. This RNG process has a built-in self-test, which is not a concern for this hardware Trojan. The modifications done by this Trojan still passes both the built-in self-test, but also the NIST test suite. The RNG uses an entropy source and digital post-processing to securely generate the 128-bit numbers. The entropy source is supposed to be complete randomness based on physical processes occurring. Digital post-processing has two components: an online health test unit and a cryptographically secured deterministic random bit generator. The online health test ensures that the generated numbers by the entropy source are truly random with minimum entropy. The deterministic random bit generator has a conditioner and a rate matcher. The conditioner computes new seed values based for the rate matcher, and the rate matcher computes the random 128-bit numbers based on certain equations. The Trojan introduced in this paper has a goal of reducing the attack complexity to n number of chosen bits. It does this by using the dopant Trojan to modify the flip-flop used in the rate matching equation. Thus, this attack only requires the flip-flops storing two values in the rate matching equations, C and K, while the rest of the design is unmodified. The second case study involves implementing a hidden side channel attack into an AES S-box, which is an encryption method. An IMDPL gate is added to this S-box to provide side channel resistance logic, although it still has some weaknesses. IMDPL stands for Improved Masked Dual Rail Logic. This is a gate that uses a masked bit to hopefully prevent power consumption. Every input and output of this gate, as well as their inverses, are masked with a mask bit M. The gate then performs 6 operations. This is where the Trojan comes into effect. The authors are able to insert a Trojan that causes a predictable power consumption that is independent of the masked bit. This power consumption can then be used to reveal secret data. Although this Trojan has been added, it does not affect the side channel resistance, and thus it will still pass security checks. With this Trojan, only the owner of the Trojan can take advantage of this exploit. This attack cannot be detected by functional testing, optical inspection, and golden chip verification. The authors describe the Trojan insertion as very simple since there are no concerns of additional routing or searching for empty space within the design to fit other gates. The authors also state that it is relatively easy to find a suitable location for their Trojan since all they have to do is look for an IMDPL gate with inverse inputs. To conclude, the authors introduced a new hardware Trojan that can be implemented at a lower level than traditional hardware Trojans. The authors looked at 2 cases of implementing a difficult-to-detect hardware Trojan that only required modifying dopant masks, whereas other Trojans required transitions, gates, etc., transistors, gates, etc., to be added. This Trojan is immune to optical detection, which makes it hard to verify a golden chip. Without a golden chip, it is hard to detect Trojans post-manufacturing. The first case involved breaking any possible key generated by Intel's RNG, yet still passing self-tests, as well as NIST's test suite. This directly showed that a commonly used piece of hardware can be a real-life target for this type of hardware Trojan. The second case changed the power profile of two gates while not changing the logic value of any gate. Thus, a Trojan can be added that does not open vulnerabilities to other side channel attacks, while also implementing a hidden side channel attack that can only be used by the owner of the Trojan that understands the power model. This leads to the question of how these Trojans can be detected in the future. To end this discussion, I would like to mention my favorite sentence in this paper, as it truly summarizes the importance of preventing hardware Trojans. Integrated circuits are the heart of virtually all modern applications. Thus, if a hardware Trojan can go undetected, just about any device could be at risk. Thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at jem29554@vt.edu. Thank you. And here are my sources.